The morning I pulled my moving truck up the winding gravel drive of Driftwood Lake Estates, the sun sat low over the water, throwing that glittery shimmer across the ripples that makes a lake feel like the promise of a calm life. That, at least, was what I told myself as I stepped out onto my new property, stretching stiff muscles and inhaling the woodsy scent of pine, algae, and humid air. I had spent months searching for the right place, somewhere quiet, secluded, and free from the exhausting grind of city living. Driftwood Lake had seemed perfect from the photos, and even better in person the day I toured it. Towering oaks, quiet water, the faint creak of docks swaying with the current. Peace, solitude, a place to reset. What I didn't know was that Driftwood Lake had its own ecosystem of politics, drama, and unspoken hierarchy, and that the moment I showed up, the balance of that ecosystem would be shattered. My property stretched along a long curve of shoreline, ending in a sizable peninsula that jutted gently into the water. From there, several aging docks branched outward like skeletal fingers. During the tour, the realtor had mentioned them briefly. The sellers, a retired couple eager to move south, included them in the sale, though I assumed the neighborhood shared them somehow. The realtor's tone had been casual enough that I barely dwelled on it. I simply nodded and moved on, admiring the view instead of reading too deeply into it. The contract, however, was clear. The land and the docks belonged to the property owner. At the time, it felt like a small, inconsequential detail. But as my moving truck rumbled to a stop that first morning, still idling, still smelling like heated rubber and cardboard dust, I noticed something unexpected. Several residents were already gathered near the end of my driveway. 4 of them, arms crossed, faces stern, matching polo shirts, all embroidered with the same 3 letters I had hoped I wouldn't see so soon. HOA. The Homeowners Association of Driftwood Lake Estates had arrived before I had even finished parking. Their presence didn't feel welcoming. The way they stood, perfectly aligned in a rigid row, looked less like a greeting committee and more like an enforcement squad. They watched every movement, my truck door closing, my feet crunching on gravel, my gaze drifting toward the lake, and they followed it too, as if they were measuring how much of the view I was allowed to claim. And as I glanced down toward the shoreline, I understood at least a fraction of their interest. A dozen residents, maybe more, were scattered along my docks. Some were fishing, others were leaning back in folding chairs. A few had kayaks tied up neatly. They were acting like the space was theirs, completely oblivious to the fact that the property had changed hands. It was only then, as the HOA board approached my driveway with stiff, formal precision, that the puzzle pieces started sliding toward one another. It wasn't that they were upset about my arrival, it was that my arrival had consequences for them. Consequences they didn't plan for. Consequences involving the lake access they had taken for granted. The sun was warmer now, climbing higher, and I felt sweat forming along my hairline, not from heat, but from the heavy realization that something was off, very off. My first few minutes in this supposedly peaceful neighborhood had the tense energy of a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Even the birds seemed quieter. Even the breeze seemed cautious. I looked at the HOA board members again, and their expressions confirmed it. I wasn't just the new neighbor. I was an intrusion into a system they believed they ran, a system they thought I would fall into without question. A system where the lake, the docks, and even the shoreline had been operating under their control long before I arrived. But the paperwork, the deed, sitting safely in a sealed envelope on the front seat of my truck, said otherwise. I didn't know the full history yet. I didn't know how the previous owners had allowed this strange arrangement to develop, or why they hadn't enforced their property rights. Maybe they had simply been kind. Maybe they had hated conflict. Maybe they had been bullied into compliance. I wouldn't understand all of it until later, long after the HOA began to show their true colors. For now, all I knew was that something territorial was simmering beneath the surface. The HOA began moving closer, stepping onto the property like they had some unspoken right to do so. Their eyes shifted between my face and the shoreline with the intensity of people who believed they were losing something that belonged to them. The rest of the neighborhood watched too. Word must have spread fast. A new owner on the lake, someone they didn't know, someone who might not play by their rules. There was a tension to the air that felt like an incoming storm, the kind that rolls over the lake in dark sheets, heavy and unavoidable. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe they simply wanted to welcome me. Maybe they were here to introduce themselves, hand me a packet of guidelines, and leave me to my moving boxes. But as they approached, their posture grew sharper, their expressions grew colder, and the energy around them felt unmistakably confrontational. Still, I kept quiet. I let them approach. I let the scene play out because I needed to understand what I was stepping into. It was clear they expected me to fall into line, to behave like every owner before me, compliant, deferential, and willing to hand over access to the lake without question. But they didn't know what was sitting in my glove compartment. They didn't know the property lines. They didn't know the docks were legally mine. They didn't know that this quiet peninsula they loved to use, the one they saw as a shared community amenity, was in fact privately owned by the newcomer they now stood face to face with. And as the air thickened with the weight of unspoken hostility, one thing became painfully obvious. I wasn't the intruder. I was the rightful owner. They were the ones who had been trespassing for years. But the HOA wasn't the type to give up territory without a fight, and it didn't take long before they began their push. A push that would turn my peaceful lakeside dream into a whirlwind of accusations, threats, and escalating drama that would drag the entire neighborhood into chaos. And it all started right there, on my first morning, before I had even stepped foot inside my new home. The first storm cloud rolled in with the HOA board, and it was only the beginning.
The HOA board didn't waste time. Before I had even unpacked the first box, the quiet hum of the lake community shifted into a coordinated, almost military-style operation. It was as if my arrival had activated some long-prepared protocol, a plan they had rehearsed countless times whenever a homeowner dared to step out of line. Except this time, it wasn't a rule violation they were responding to. It was something far more threatening to their sense of control. The rightful owner reclaiming land they believed belonged to them. I watched as the 4 board members spread out across the edges of my driveway, forming a semicircle that blocked the path toward the lake. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Their stiff posture, crossed arms, and tightly pinched expressions made their intentions clear. They acted like they were intercepting an intruder rather than acknowledging a resident who had fully purchased the property they now stood on. Behind them, the lake shimmered innocently, unaware of the storm gathering around it. The dock swayed softly in the lazy current as if nothing had changed, even though in the eyes of the HOA, everything had. The first strike came that same afternoon. I was halfway through organizing the garage when I heard the sound. A firm, deliberate knock on the front door. Not a neighbor's friendly tap or a casual introduction. It was the type of knock that carries expectation, authority, and the silent threat of consequences if ignored. I wiped the dust off my hands and opened the door. On my welcome mat lay a thick packet of documents, bound with a plastic cover and clipped neatly at the edge. A business card from the HOA president was tucked under the front page. The packet wasn't placed gently. It was positioned like evidence in an investigation, full of highlighted sections, bolded rules, and pre-checked violation forms. They hadn't even waited for me to settle in. The first sheet was a notice. Not a welcome letter, not an introduction, but a formal demand for immediate compliance with community regulations. It listed expectations, responsibilities, and various clarifications regarding lake access. The language was carefully crafted, phrased with that passive-aggressive politeness HOA boards had perfected over years of power wielding. The most telling section, however, was buried on page 5 under a header titled Community Lake Usage Guidelines. It outlined how the docks, shoreline, and fishing areas had been traditionally managed by the HOA for community benefit. The wording was slippery, intentionally ambiguous, never outright claiming ownership, but implying a shared arrangement that no homeowner was expected to challenge. And at the bottom of that page, stamped with a fresh ink signature from the HOA president, sat a line that made the situation painfully clear. New residents are expected to honor the long-standing community practice of granting full access to the lakeside areas as maintained by the HOA. A practice, not a rule. A custom, not a legal agreement. An expectation, not a requirement. They weren't trying to enforce a regulation. They were trying to preserve an illusion. For years, they had operated under the assumption that homeowners would either not read their deed carefully or would be too intimidated to challenge the system. The previous owners had likely complied out of convenience, kindness, or exhaustion, and the HOA had grown comfortable, too comfortable, believing they controlled the lake, the docks, and every inch of the shoreline, despite having no legal authority over them. They had stormed my property on day one because they feared that control slipping through their fingers, and the packet was their attempt to tighten their grip. But even more revealing was the final attachment, a pre-written acknowledgement of community lake rights, a form they expected me to sign, a form that if I did sign it, would grant them official access to the property they had been using without permission for years. It was a trap disguised as a welcome packet. The packet was delivered without a signature, without a verbal greeting, without the courtesy of explanation. They didn't want conversation. They wanted compliance. They wanted submission. They wanted the newcomer to fall in line and surrender the shoreline quietly, just like everyone else had. But the weight of the deed in my glove compartment still echoed in my mind. The property survey, the legal description, the dock permits, all of it was crystal clear. The HOA had no jurisdiction on my land, no authority, no rights whatsoever. And they knew it, which made their next move even more predictable. By late afternoon, as shadows stretched across the yard, a small crowd had gathered near the water. Residents wandered onto my docks with casual familiarity, oblivious or indifferent to the fact that ownership had changed. Fishing lines were already cast, folding chairs unfolded. Someone even pulled a cooler across the planks, leaving deep scratches in the wood that made me wince. It was as if they were testing me, pushing the boundaries to see how far they could go before the new owner cracked. They were used to being in control, and this was their way of reinforcing the hierarchy. The HOA dictates access, the homeowners comply, and the lake remains a community playground. But I had no intention of playing a part in their script. I didn't confront them, not yet, because understanding an opponent's habits and methods is more powerful than challenging them blindly. So I watched from a distance how they claimed the space, how the HOA patrolled the shoreline, how neighbors whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the house as if waiting for me to break. Every action was calculated. Every movement was part of a larger strategy. By evening, the HOA board had returned to the end of my driveway, this time leaving a bright orange notice taped to my mailbox. The color was chosen deliberately, loud, urgent, aggressive. An initial compliance reminder, it claimed, citing my lack of cooperation with customary community expectations regarding lake access. It was laughably flimsy, legally meaningless, and coated with the artificial authority the HOA relied on to keep the neighborhood in check. Yet the attempt itself made one thing undeniable. They were not going to back down. They believed the lake was theirs. They believed the docks were theirs. And they believed they could intimidate the new homeowner into signing away a portion of property they had no legitimate claim to. But the truth sat firmly in my hands. Ownership, documented and indisputable. And while the HOA was busy escalating their tactics, they hadn't considered one very important detail. I was patient, and I was prepared, and I had every intention of taking back what was mine. As the next morning arrived with an unusual quiet, the sort of hush that clings to a neighborhood before tension breaks into something louder. Driftwood Lake Estates had an eerie stillness to it, like a stage reset overnight for the next act of a drama no one wanted to admit they were watching. I stepped outside to a cool mist rising off the lake, drifting lazily across the docks the HOA believed belonged to them. The wood looked weathered and splintered, the pads stained from years of heavy use. The more I studied them, the more I realized how deeply the HOA had embedded itself into property it never owned. And that was the moment the shift happened, when annoyance transformed into a firm resolve. I had moved here for peace, but they had made it clear I wouldn't get any until I proved what the deed already spelled out in black and white. They wanted a battle over the lake. Fine, but it would be fought on my terms. The first step was simple. I needed information, not assumptions, not hearsay, cold, hard documentation. Inside, I spread the paperwork out on my kitchen table. The deed, surveys, aerial maps, dock permits, old county records I had requested during the purchase. The sellers had been disorganized, but not negligent. Their real estate folder held decades of files, property boundary adjustments, shoreline rights agreements dating back to the early 70s, and permits for every dock pole that stabbed into the lakebed. The deeper I read, the stranger the picture became. Driftwood Lake Estates didn't originally have an HOA. The neighborhood had formed organically, with residents informally sharing resources. Only years later did a small collective invent a homeowners association, more as a social club than a governing body. Over time, its mission expanded, then twisted into a tool for control. The lake, however, had never been included in their charter. In every document, one fact stayed consistent. My shoreline was privately owned, not managed, not overseen, not maintained for community benefit. Owned, fully, legally, undeniably. But somehow, the HOA had built a community identity around using the docks I now owned. Fishing tournaments, kayak meetups, summer picnics, all of it had taken place on land they never had permission to use. Over time, their consistent use morphed into false confidence, a belief that consistency creates entitlement. But the law doesn't work that way. Use does not equal ownership. The more I uncovered, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules. They were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules. They were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth,
a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline soft and cool beneath my shoes. The docks creaked underfoot, complaining with every step. Kayak ropes were knotted carelessly around the posts, and an abandoned tackle box lay open, its contents scattered like someone left in a hurry the night before. The deeper I walked, the more signs I found. Litter from weekly community gatherings, rust spots from grills placed directly on the planks, screws that had been replaced haphazardly by residents who assumed maintenance was a shared responsibility. As the more I studied them, the more I understood why the HOA had reacted with such aggression the moment I arrived. They weren't protecting rules, they were protecting a myth, a story they had invested their authority in for years, a story my deed threatened to end. By late morning, I took a walk to the lake's edge. I needed to see the territory firsthand. The grass was still wet from dew, the shoreline.
By the next morning, the HOA's escalation was impossible to ignore. The bright yellow notice on my door had already been replaced, upgraded, in their eyes, to a bold red violation warning taped across my mailbox. It was positioned so aggressively that it blocked the small metal door, as if the HOA wanted to ensure I couldn't receive anything that didn't come from them. Red meant urgency, danger, non-compliance. But in their haste to intimidate, they overlooked one crucial detail. They still had no authority here. The sun had barely risen when the neighborhood started its usual slow stir. A jogger passed by with a stiff nod. A neighbor walked her dog while keeping her eyes fixed anywhere except my property. A man in a fishing hat wheeled a cooler down the road, headed toward the shoreline he assumed would always be open to him. Everyone behaved the same way they always had, unquestioning, habitual, certain that the lake belonged to them, not to the landowner whose gravel drive they quietly hurried past. But I had spent the previous night assembling everything I needed: documents, copies, printed maps, laminated boundary lines, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The HOA had made it clear they weren't going to stop, and so I reached the conclusion they had forced me toward. If they insisted on acting like the lake access was communal property, then I needed to remind them, unmistakably, that it wasn't. The lake needed to be closed. Not permanently, not cruelly, but firmly and unquestionably until the HOA understood that authority and tradition were not the same thing. They couldn't bully their way into ownership, they couldn't intimidate their way into access, and they couldn't continue weaponizing the ignorance of past owners to maintain a fantasy of control. So shortly after sunrise, I walked down the slope toward the water. The lake's surface was smooth, almost glassy. Mist curled across the docks like slow-moving smoke, and the air carried the earthy scent of wet wood. For a moment, I paused at the foot of the first dock, letting my eyes travel across its length. The screws rusted from improper repairs, the boards warped from chairs scraping across them, the cracks widened by years of unsupervised use. This wasn't a shared amenity. It was a neglected piece of private property. And today, it would be reclaimed. One by one, I installed temporary closure signs at the start of each dock. Durable, weatherproof markers that stated in clear, non-negotiable terms, private property, access suspended pending review. Not angry, not dramatic, just factual. Beneath each sign, I attached a laminated map showing the property boundaries as recorded by the county. I posted photocopies of the deed showing ownership of the shoreline and structures. I even added a QR code linking to the public parcel map database. There would be no excuses, no misunderstandings, no wiggle room for the HOA's creative interpretation of community tradition. The first neighbor to notice was a man carrying a fishing pole. He slowed as he approached the sign, his confusion visible even from a distance. His steps faltered, his shoulders tightened, not out of anger, but out of the sudden realization that something he had taken for granted had shifted beneath him. He stared at the sign for several long seconds before turning back the way he came. He didn't confront me. He didn't call the HOA. He simply walked away, quietly, thoughtfully, and for the first time, with a hint of acknowledgement that the property might not be what the HOA had always claimed. That moment, subtle as it was, confirmed everything. The HOA wasn't powerful because they had authority. They were powerful because no one ever questioned them. Now, they were being questioned. The second neighbor arrived minutes later, wheeling a kayak behind her. She stopped abruptly, brows lifting as she read through the posted documents. She leaned in, tracing the boundary lines on the map with her finger. A frown formed, not angry, but embarrassed, like someone realizing they'd been misled. She too turned around without a word. 2 early morning retreats, 2 quiet acknowledgments. The cracks were already forming. But the real confrontation was inevitable. The HOA arrived in a cluster of agitated energy. 4 board members, their matching polo shirts crisp and threatening in their uniformity, marched toward me with brisk, purposeful steps. Their expressions were sharp, pinched, and deeply offended, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had done something they didn't approve of. And worse, something they didn't authorize. Their arrival was almost theatrical. The lake behind them shimmered under the rising sun. The dock stood blocked off with clear signage. The boundary maps fluttered slightly in the breeze. It was a scene they were not prepared to face, because for the first time, they weren't in control. They didn't yell, though agitation radiated from them. They didn't speak, not at first. They simply stood in a rigid, accusatory formation, staring at the signs, then at me, then at the signs again, as if hoping the words would change under their scrutiny. But the truth didn't bend for them. I didn't react. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. Everything they needed to know was posted in front of them, backed by county records, legal descriptions, and documentation they had never bothered to read. At last, one of them stepped forward, pointing toward the closure notices with a stiff, trembling hand. It was clear they expected compliance, an immediate apology, the dismantling of the signs, and the return to their established order. But authority built on illusion collapses the moment reality enters the room. And reality was nailed to the posts of every dock. The HOA members exchanged frustrated glances, their formation weakening as uncertainty seeped into their rigid posture. They were angry, but under that anger was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed. Fear of the neighborhood learning that the lake access they bragged about wasn't theirs to promise. They backed away slowly, their silence louder than any confrontation could have been. The dock stood closed. The documents stood firm. And the first blow to the HOA's long-standing illusion had landed with perfect precision. But the battle wasn't over. In fact, the real war was about to begin. Because when people who rely on power lose control, they don't retreat, they retaliate.
The day after I closed the lake, the neighborhood transformed from a quiet lakeside community into a simmering pressure cooker. The misty calm of the shoreline had been replaced by the low murmur of rumors traveling from porch to porch, mailbox to mailbox, and phone call to phone call. The dock stood empty for the first time in years, sealed off with boundary maps and legal declarations that the HOA could not simply tear down without consequences. And the HOA knew it. They circled the neighborhood with a kind of wounded pride, their usual confidence cracked but not broken. They had built their identity around control, and nothing threatened a self-appointed ruler more than the loss of territory they had convinced themselves they owned. The closure signs were a direct hit to their authority, and they responded the only way people like them knew how. They mobilized. By mid-morning, their retaliation began. The first strike arrived in my mailbox, taped aggressively on all four sides. A violation notice almost comically thick, stapled together in what looked like a rush of frantic printing. Page after page accused me of everything from disturbing community harmony to obstructing communal resources and even creating unauthorized structural signage on HOA-managed land. The irony was almost poetic. None of the land referenced belonged to them. Not 1 inch of shoreline was part of the HOA's jurisdiction. They were simply throwing paperwork at the problem, hoping volume could substitute for authority. I left the packet on my kitchen counter, its pages fanning open like a defeated peacock. It was useless, powerless, and ultimately meaningless, but it signaled the escalation ahead. By afternoon, their retaliation grew bolder. A group of board members positioned themselves across the street, not on my property, but close enough to observe. They gathered under the pretense of a routine review walk, clipboards in hand, writing notes with dramatic flourishes meant to be seen. They didn't approach the lake. They didn't go near the docks. They didn't dare remove the signs. Instead, they hovered near the edge of my property like a pack of territorial geese, agitated and unsure of their next move, but determined to remind everyone they still held power, even if it was slipping away. Their restraint, however, didn't last long. The second strike came that evening when the HOA initiated a community-wide emergency meeting. Neighbors filed into the clubhouse, a plain, aging building that sat at the center of Driftwood Lake Estates, after receiving urgent emails and text alerts warning of a critical disruption to neighborhood order. Word spread quickly. The meeting was about me. I stayed home. If the HOA wanted a spectacle, they could perform without an audience. From my porch, I could see residents hurrying through dusk toward the clubhouse, their silhouettes framed by the orange glow of porch lanterns. Some walked with curiosity, others with indignation, and a few with hesitant discomfort, unsure which side of the conflict they should stand on. And at the center of it all, the HOA president stood like a conductor, ready to lead a desperate orchestra. Inside, their voices rose and fell in muffled waves. Although I couldn't hear specific words, the tone was unmistakable, outrage laced with panic, and beneath it, the fragile tremor of an authority being questioned for the first time. 30 minutes later, the first residents began trickling out. Their faces told me everything I needed to know. Confusion, skepticism, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt directed not at me, but at the HOA. Their story was no longer holding. The closure signs had done more than restrict access. They had forced people to confront a truth the HOA had hidden for years. Many residents had never seen a boundary map, never read a deed, never questioned whose land they were standing on when they cast their fishing lines or tied their kayaks. The HOA's narrative had been sufficient until documentation challenged fiction. But the HOA wasn't going down quietly. Their third strike arrived the next morning in the form of a bold announcement posted on the community bulletin board and emailed to every resident. Mandatory lake restoration fee, effective immediately.
It was a desperate move, a sudden special assessment claiming that the lake required emergency maintenance due to unauthorized interference by the new homeowner. They demanded a hefty fee from every resident to restore access, implying that I had caused damage to something they controlled. It was an open gamble. If residents paid out of fear, the HOA could maintain the illusion of power. If they refused, the facade would crumble. The reaction was immediate. Small groups of neighbors clustered in driveways, whispering. Some shook their heads angrily. Others studied their emails with narrowed eyes, scrolling back and forth through the message as if searching for logic that wasn't there. A few marched straight to the HOA president's house, their voices sharp and accusatory. The cracks widened. And then, unexpectedly, the first direct consequence hit the HOA president herself. A man who had been using the lake for decades, one of the earliest residents, approached my property fence with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't cross the boundary. He didn't speak. He simply stood there and examined one of the posted maps with intense focus. His expression shifted subtly as he traced the property lines with his eyes. Moments later, he walked directly to the HOA board members gathered nearby and confronted them. Not loudly, not theatrically, just firmly. He held the printed map up in front of them, tapping the lines with a weathered finger. The president's face paled. The rest of the board stiffened in place, their confidence faltering beneath the weight of documentation they could no longer deny. It was the first time a resident had openly challenged them, and it wouldn't be the last. The HOA responded, predictably, by doubling down. They issued yet another notice to me, claiming I was responsible for community unrest. They attempted to threaten fines, suspension of voting rights, and even legal action. But each threat was weaker than the last, hollow and fraying at the edges. Because, for the first time, the neighborhood wasn't blindly accepting their narrative. They were watching, reading, thinking, questioning. And the HOA, which once so commanding and certain, was starting to unravel under its own weight. They had one last move left, one last act of retaliation, the most desperate and dangerous one yet, the kind that could either restore their crumbling power or destroy it completely. It was a move I didn't see coming, one that would escalate everything to a level no homeowner expects when they buy a quiet lake property.
By the time dawn rose on the morning of the final hearing, the entire community had split itself into two distinct camps. Those who had lived quietly under the HOA's rigid thumb for years, enduring their fines, their threats, their impossible expectations, arrived with lawn chairs and thermoses, eager to witness the moment someone finally stood up to the organization that had dominated every corner of their suburban lives. The other side consisted of the board members themselves, their supporters, and those who clung to the belief that unquestioning obedience somehow guaranteed order. Both groups gathered near the county building, a sea of tension and caffeine, murmuring predictions of how the day might end. The courthouse doors opened at 9 sharp, and the air shifted with a subtle but unmistakable weight. This case, unlike the petty disputes the HOA typically pursued, had grown into something greater, something symbolic. What began as their demand that I surrender their lake had spiraled into a legal unraveling that exposed decades of mismanagement, buried grievances, and the uncomfortable truth that the board's authority rested mostly on intimidation rather than legitimacy. Inside the hearing chamber, the atmosphere felt oddly electric. The judge, firm-eyed and expressionless, took her seat with the intention of moving efficiently through the mountain of evidence. In front of her sat stacks of documents, surveys from the 1970s, property plats, dock permits, financial ledgers, procedural motions, and the thick, glossy binder of the HOA's initial complaint, the one they were now desperately trying to distance themselves from. The board president attempted to read a prepared statement, but the judge cut her off almost immediately. The courtroom, she explained, was not a stage for dramatic monologues or moral lectures about community cohesion. It was a place for facts, legality, and proof. And the documents, she noted, already spoke volumes. The county's land specialist presented a detailed breakdown that aligned perfectly with everything I had claimed weeks earlier. Not only did I own the lake outright, but every dock the HOA had used, repaired, assigned, or fined people over existed on my personal property, right down to the rusted metal ladder on Dock 7 and the broken cleat on Dock 12. The HOA, in effect, had been operating a rental business for assets they didn't own. Then came the financial analyst's findings. When the judge asked the HOA's treasurer whether they had ever conducted a formal audit, his voice nearly disappeared. Years of dock fee collections, fine payments, and repairs had moved through accounts with almost no oversight. It wasn't criminal, at least not yet, but it was reckless, and it directly undermined the board's claim of diligent stewardship. Every attempt they made to justify their behavior collapsed under the weight of the paper trail. They had overreached so spectacularly that even their own attorney looked ready to slide under the table. By midday, the judge called a recess to deliberate. As the room emptied into the hallway, the crowd split again, some whispering, others pacing, some wearing expressions of personal vindication. A few board members huddled together, panic and disbelief etched across their features, whispering furiously about strategies, appeals, or ways to spin the outcome to their members. But the truth was already too large to contain. News reporters had arrived earlier that morning, alerted by residents who were tired of dealing with an HOA that treated them like tenants rather than homeowners. Cameras caught every uncomfortable glance and overheard every muttered admission from board members who never expected their authority to be challenged, let alone dismantled by their own negligence. When the judge finally returned, the crowd rushed back into the chamber. The decision, she explained, was not only clear, it was unavoidable. The HOA had no legal claim to the lake or its docks. Their fines were invalid. Their threats were baseless. Their attempts to seize, control, or oversee the property were beyond their authority. Further, they were forbidden from charging any future fees or establishing rules pertaining to my land. The board was ordered to refund dock fees collected over the past several years, as well as cover all legal costs incurred from their false claims. A gasp rippled through the audience. Some people cheered softly. Others sat stunned. The board president pressed her lips into a thin line, absorbing the full force of a reality she never imagined. The HOA's reign over the lake was officially dead. When the gavel struck, closing the hearing, it felt like the final echo of a long, suffocating era. Outside the building, residents approached me with a flood of gratitude and apologies. Many admitted they knew the board was overbearing for years, but felt powerless, afraid that speaking up would invite retaliation. Some shook my hand with visible relief. Others offered to help rebuild the community's structure in a healthier, more neighbor-focused direction. For the first time in years, neighbors felt like neighbors instead of subjects. As for the lake, it transformed almost overnight. Without the HOA's restrictive regulations, families returned to the docks freely, no longer worrying about unexpected fines for unauthorized fishing or non-compliant umbrellas. Fishermen laughed together again. Kids cannonballed without fear. Kayakers drifted along the quiet shallows, enjoying the water without watching for clipboard-wielding board members. For me, the lake became something different, too. No longer a battleground, no longer a point of contention, but a space of calm. On warm evenings, I would sit at the end of Dock 4, watching the orange reflection of sunset ripple across the water, grateful that the chaos had finally settled. The storm the HOA unleashed on the day I moved in had swelled into something enormous, loud, destructive, exhausting. But storms, no matter how fierce, eventually pass. And when they do, they often wash away what was rotten, leaving behind room for growth. In the quiet that followed, the lake breathed again, the community breathed again, and at long last, so did I. And that wraps up today's story from the wild world of HOAs, where the rules are strict, the drama is real, and the Karens never seem to rest. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected twists, overreach, and well-deserved justice, make sure you hit that like button and help this story reach more people who love neighborhood chaos as much as we do. Don't forget to subscribe to HOA Story Files for more unbelievable HOA meltdowns, entitled neighbor showdowns, and property battles that go completely off the rails. We've got new stories coming your way every week, each one more outrageous than the last. And if you have an HOA nightmare, a petty neighbor war, or a story where a Karen finally got what was coming, send it in. Your story might be featured in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, when the HOA knocks, the drama usually follows.